Good afternoon. My name is Sharon Sellers. I am the senior manager in the Sibley Senior Association. I manage our club memory program, and I want to extend a wonderful welcome to our quarterly discussion on race. And we've been doing this for almost a year right now. So we're just happy to have you with us. Today, we're gonna focus on Nikole Hannah-Jones's book, The 1619 Project, A New Origin Story. Please join our discussion by placing your questions in our Q&A area. This webinar is being recorded and a link will be emailed to all participants. So let me introduce our three esteemed panelists. I want to welcome back Stephen K. Ragsdale. He has been a panelist with us on several of our previous sessions, so always glad to have you back, Steve. Steve is a senior consultant and a former administrator with over 25 years of building and managing hospital operations. He's worked hard on developing healthcare innovations and pathways to safer care. His work in diversity, equity, and inclusion is guided by his deep understanding and desire to appreciate the concepts that drive difference as a social construct. Steve has a degree in history and cultural studies in Latin America. He is part of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and joined the associate faculty in January of 2020. Steve also has a Master of Science in Law, and he serves on the board of directors of the Baltimore City Historical Society. Steve is born in Baltimore City and continues to enjoy living in Maryland. So welcome, Steve. So glad to have you again.
Glad to be here.
Okay, next I want to introduce Mike O'Brien. Mike is an independent writer who lives and works in Vienna, Virginia. He is graduate of American University School of Communication. His book, We Shall Not Be Moved, the Jackson Woolworth Sit-In and the Movement It Inspired, was published in 2013. And in 2014, he was awarded the prestigious Lillian Smith Book Award, which honors authors who, through their writing, carry on Smith's legacy of elucidating the conditions of racial and social inequality and proposing a vision of justice and human understanding. So glad to have you with us, Mike.
Great to be here, Sharon. Thank you.
Wonderful. And I want to now introduce Linda Critchlow-White, a native Washingtonian. She has a master's degree from Howard in human ecology and a second master's in library and information science. She has taught home economics for over 20 years, and she's also served as a school library media specialist. Along the way, she also served as the Washington representative for the Educational and Cultural Exchange Program, Operation Crossroads Africa, and that is exactly where our paths crossed. Linda has been working on preserving her family history since about 2006. She has done so much. She serves on the board of the Children's Africana Book Awards and is considered an expert in children's multicultural literature. I think it's also notable that she's been the president of the James Dent Walker chapter of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. She volunteers at the National Museum of African American History and Culture as well. I think the other thing that I do want to share about Linda is that she, after discovering a memoir that her mother had typed, she decided to publish Back There Then, a historical and genealogical memoir in 2014. So Linda, I want to definitely welcome you to our panel as well.
Thank you, Sharon, and nice to be part of the panel. Okay.
Wonderful, wonderful. So let's get started. I want to start off by sharing the book's purpose. But before I do that, I just want to see if our panelists have a word of wisdom or something that you would like to share about yourself just before we get started. So I'm going to start with Steve. If you'd like to share a little bit about yourself, feel free to share anything about yourself.
So professionally, I think I'm best described as a former hospital administrator in recovery, right? I mean, and so I've had to unlearn a lot of things in order to kind of like reconstruct my understanding of like what it means to move forward and to progress, in particular in and around healthcare. Anybody who's checked in and who's some of the folks who've been on the line before know my deep abiding dedication to understanding history. And I got the thing I'll share with the group is I really got a chance to flex that muscle by teaching a group of undergrads a course on the history of race and medicine in contemporary perspectives. You want something fun to do? That was, we often get told that we share a lot and we teach, but what I took from that experience was I felt like much more than I'd given.
Okay. Thank you so much. I certainly appreciate that. Mike, welcome. Please share something with us.
Well, it's just great to be here and to be part of this important discussion. You know, I just noticed that the 1619 Project is #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, you know, first out and right to the top. And this is a topic that is of great interest to America right now. So I'm just thrilled to be part of the discussion. I wanted to kick in a little bit about Baltimore. Steve, I actually went to school in Baltimore for 4 years at St. Mary's Seminary College out in Catonsville. And that's really where, and I looked you up a little bit and I saw you have an amazing bibliography of Baltimore references online. And I wish I had had that when I was back in the day, you know.
And deep Catholic roots. And deep Catholic roots.
So you know what I'm talking about. And it was while at the seminary in Baltimore that I guess you'd say my interest in issues about civil rights deepened, particularly in the nonviolent civil rights movement, and also in service projects that we would go out into the community and do, essentially in downtown, blighted Baltimore City. So I was privileged really to have that experience in my college years. Later on, Linda, you might be interested in this. I was on the board of Teaching for Change for 4 years, and that's a group that really pushes out a lot of diverse children's literature.
Right.
As well as kind of working with schools to try to tell history from the bottom up. So I've got that experience. And also after my book was published, decided I better start practicing what I preach. So I joined our local NAACP here in Fairfax County. And from 2015 to 2019 was part of their executive committee and worked on a lot of projects, including changing the names of Confederate names of some of the high schools here in Fairfax. So that's enough about me.
Wonderful. And welcome, Linda.
Well, thank you again. So first of all, you see my name under my image says Linda Critchlow White, AUGS, DC. So just to be real clear, AUGS is Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. And we are a national organization. I actually have in front of me a copy of, they call it a syllabus from our 2020 annual conference, where the theme was From 1619 Virginia to present day, correcting the national narrative in the midst of COVID-19. So I've had the opportunity to kind of hear and take a look at what we call 1619 for a few years now. In fact, I first heard a panel discussion at the Library of Congress in 2018. It included some Native Americans. It included a professor of history from Norfolk State University and some other people. And that was kind of like, I'm going to call it my introduction. Now as a genealogist and not exactly a historian, I've kind of heard of 1619. I think it was a great awakening for a lot of us. But I just want to start with this little quote from Henry Louis Gates. And he says that in genealogy, we look at family history. And wait a minute. Oh, he says, all historians generalize from particulars. And often, if you look at a historian's footnotes, the number of examples of specific cases is very, very small. But as we do our family trees, we add specificity to the raw data from which historians can generalize. So I'm here today, not as a historian, not even really as a genealogist, and that's another story, because genealogists, real genealogists have a certain certification. I do family history, but my point is genealogists and family historians kind of bring an interesting, or can bring an interesting perspective to history, and in this case, to 1619.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Linda. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and let me just kind of share what Nikole Hannah-Jones has listed as the book's purpose. She says that the 1619 Project, it aims to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contribution of Black Americans at the very center of our national narrative, and further seeks to demonstrate how the enslavement of Africans continues to disadvantage Black Americans today. What I found interesting is that the new origin story explores the relationship of slavery to present day capitalism, healthcare, mass incarceration, among other topics. Yet this project has drawn the fire both from mainstream historians and right-wing political figures. So let's talk about that. The central idea of the book could be considered the country's origin. When it was first published in 2019, it was met by some very fierce backlash by, again, the historians, the politicians, and even state lawmakers legislating against it by name. Did the strength of that backlash surprise you? Linda, you first.
It did surprise me in the same way that there was this major backlash after the Obama presidency. It did take me by surprise. I thought we were heading in a new direction, so to speak. But I just want to say, and you can stop me at any point if this is out of line or out of order. But I like to think that what Nikole Hannah-Jones is saying and doing is not that new. And I see her as kind of a philosopher, as we've had philosophers from Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, all the way to Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, of course, Howard Zinn, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and Martin Luther King, so many people, Frederick Douglass, and then Frederick Douglass was a philosopher in the 19th century. And I think also people kind of think of him as an anomaly, but there were lots of people like him. It's just that his story was much more documented. But then there were books like They Came Before Columbus.
Absolutely.
Black Masters, which actually has nothing to do with our freedom so much as about Black folks who were, in some cases, slave owners. Black abolitionists, Benjamin Quarles, and one of the classics, and there's so many, From Slavery to Freedom, by a person who was a certified, respected historian.
John Hope Franklin.
John Hope Franklin. So what I'm saying is, it's really nothing new. but people come up with something like Sharon, you mentioned how you and I had been connected via Crossroads Africa. So
Right.
many of us who came of age in the 60s and 70s, we thought we just discovered Africa, right? But some of my recent research, and again, I should have known this stuff, but I was researching historically Black colleges and universities and learned that in the early 1800s, there was a lot of exchange between African countries and the United States, going back to the 1820s and so on. I don't know if you know the name, the Blydens, Edward Blyden. He was a historian, educator, sociologist, and so on. Originally from one of the countries in the Caribbean, but he also had ties to Sierra Leone and Liberia. And there were a lot of Blydens, not just one. And there were other families like this. So my point is, Africa was on the radar of everybody all along. And many of the people who were going back and forth between the United States and Africa were doing so because of the American Colonization Society, which Nikole does mention in her book. It's also something that a lot of us learned fairly recently, and these are the kinds of things that were not in our history books growing up. So it's good that Nikole is bringing it to our attention, even though it's not actually the first time. But my point is, the American Colonization Society was founded by the powers that be,
Sure.
because there were so many free African Americans or free Africans. At that time, we were still calling ourselves Africans, okay? You think AME Church and African Free School, all this stuff, okay? So there were so many free ones of us that the powers that be wanted us out of here. But we forget that we've always been achieving in our own way. Yes, there was slavery. And I guess I'm saying all this to say, the bottom line for me is I would like to see us focus more on our achievements, despite our complicated history. Look, we definitely deserved reparations. We have been mistreated since the,
All right, we're going to get to that. We're
Yes.
going to get to that.
Okay, so I'll stop right now. I told you to stop me. So
Okay.
thanks, Sharon.
Sure. Mike, did the strength of the backlash from the 1619 project, did it surprise you?
Well, I want to say as an opening statement, really, that I think this book is groundbreaking. Admittedly, this is a lot of information that has been out there for a long time, particularly in the academic world, right? But what Hannah-Jones has done is, I would call her a popularizer. She has put it all together in a way that we can all absorb it and made it in a way that we have to listen, we have to pay attention. To have it come out from the New York Times, of all places, even she says it's the blackest thing the New York Times has ever done. And she felt such, as you see in her opening preface, such a weight of responsibility that it all be just exactly right. And then of course there was going to be a backlash. This is in the middle, it came out, I thought it was August of 2018, but it was in the midst of the Trump administration. I mean, come on. Yeah. There's going to be a pushback to this narrative that completely turns the myth of 1776 on its head. It gives a completely new start date for the American story, and it's a Black a story, right? All of a sudden, Blackness has entered the picture in a way, particularly that white America is not used to hearing. So of course it's going to be a backlash. But I think it's thrilling, and I think it makes, once you understand the lens through which she is looking at American history and trying to get us to understand American history, you see everything becomes more clear. Like why are there these constant troubles between Blacks and whites? Why are Blacks disenfranchised? Why are they poorer than whites? Why are they more incarcerated than whites? All of that begins to make more sense with the concept that 1619 has to be attended to. It's not just happy, Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin and George Washington, writing these wonderful documents in 1776, and the world's a wonderful place and America is so great. It's look at what you all are doing while you're doing that. We've got incarcerated or enslaved people serving you as you are doing these wonderful things. You would not be able to be doing the things that you're doing, even economically, Thomas Jefferson, if you didn't have these enslaved people serving you. So it's we've known this all along. It's been part of our history, but it's been a little bit, it's been quiet. And as she points out, and then my friend James Lowen, who wrote the book Lies Your Teachers Told You, he pointed out as well in his book that a lot of history that is taught in American schools is just totally bunk, and that you have to dig deeper to get to the real story. And I think that's what this book is doing.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, Steve, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question.
Oh, I was so looking forward to that one.
No, let's move on. Let me just say this.
Okay, go ahead.
I want to mention some of the arguments that denounce the project. Before we get into the book, let's just talk about some of the arguments, and I want you to weigh in on it. Is the 1619 project, is it racially divisive? Does it teach children to be ashamed of the United States? Does it teach white people to be humiliated by their whiteness? If one rejects the 1619 project, how should the United States tell the story of all the crimes against Black Americans? What are your thoughts, Steve?
So I will say, I'll treat the first one, right? All the other ones, I think, are somewhat ludicrous, right? But is this divisive? In the way that America has been educated about what its history is, what its lore is, what its story is, it is most certainly divisive. Because one of the things, so I grew up in a house that I did not have supremely educated parents. My parents were high school folk, but we had a reading. We had books on the shelf. Like my shelf looks like the shelf that I had at home when I was growing up. Not as many, but we kept. And I learned about us. And so by the time I was in 7th grade, by the time we reached Black History Month, right, and I was at an integrated school at that point in my time. Baltimore was beginning to integrate schools, and the junior high school teacher handed out, in February, this list of about 50 or 60 African Americans, because we're going to have to write a report, and so she started with this proposition, well, how many of you know 5 of them? And so and I wasn't being precocious, I was just being honest. By the time we got to 35, my hand was still up, right? And the teacher in this newly integrated school, and this is an African-American teacher, made me come up and literally began to construct a sentence or two about what I knew about each of them. Now, was that part of my learning exercise? I'm not sure it was part of my, what was I was the teacher. What was this exercise supposed to, It was to challenge my understanding of history. And it's to literally test whether or not what I was saying was authentic, right? So that's how, I'm in my 50s now, but that's how I interpret what happened to me in the 7th grade. And I interpret it that way because all history is propaganda, right? I am going to reflect a little bit on the last question, because I think it's important to note that The first time I read something like this was when I was in college, and it was Howard Zinn's The People's History, right? But the people's history for most people is just not really accessible. Like, I mean, it's and I think what the 1619 Project did was took that, that very special magazine that I was never able to find a copy of because it sold out all over the country, yeah, and look, put it actually in long form, I mean, and that's what I think that was really genius about it. Now, the genius in the way that the book is constructed is we talk about America as a set of systems, and it's not, I mean, it's a set of systems as described by not the winners, but by the losers. Right. I mean, and so for the great majority of us are not, I mean, like, I don't mean to you say this in a pejorative way, but the great majority of us are not winners. We're not in the top, echelon of society. The great majority of us, sit somewhere around normality, and that's at the bottom of the rung. I mean, so she made these stories accessible to people who literally can relate to them, and the collection of writers that she used in order to construct this stories, I think, so I think that yes, I do think that using this many brilliant writers to tell this particular story, if we acknowledge that all history is propaganda, is extraordinarily divisive in the way that this country learns about itself.
Okay. Let me broaden that question, and I want to just you mentioned something, Stephen, that made me think of kind of like a big picture moment, and so let's talk about where we are right now. There's this James Baldwin quote, and it's actually in the chapter on fear, and it states, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it is faced." So do you now see a greater willingness among Americans to face the history of racism in this country, the legacy of slavery, and to begin to do the work to change it? I'm going to go to you first, Linda, on this. So do you see a greater willingness now to face our history of racism, our legacy of slavery, and to begin the work to change it?
I see a change going on in this country, but I don't attribute it to Nikole, but I attribute it to George Floyd.
Yes. Okay.
So much has changed. I mean, when we open up the newspaper, look at television, at least we see more images of Black folks than we did previously. I'm not I think that the book 1619 is creating a great opportunity for discussion. The good thing is Nikole and the New York Times had an idea and they ran with it. And whether people agree with it or not, it is making people take a look. Who just said it's on, the number one on the book list, most read books this week at least. So people are buying the book at least, hopefully reading it. And what we all have to learn is that, and as the people are teaching it for change, try to incorporate, is when we hear something, we need to, I want to say kind of question it. And the only reason I say kind of is because when I was growing up, going to school in Washington, D.C., where the schools were technically integrated because it was after 1954, but I had Black teachers, all my, 98% of my classmates were Black, but we never missed anything. If we were missing something, we didn't know about it, right? Our teachers were outstanding. Our classmates were smart. I love to say I went to school with people like Dr. Shirley Jackson. This was Roosevelt High School here in Washington, who became the, she's currently president of Rensselaer Technical University in New York.
Yeah.
And she's also the first African-American woman to get a PhD in physics from MIT. Now, actually, she was a few years ahead of me in school, and I didn't know her personally, but I like to, point that out. Another person who came behind me at Roosevelt was Isabel Wilkerson.
Sure.
And she actually came to Roosevelt at a time when the schools were kind of in a bit of turmoil. But what I'm saying is, the reason I alluded back to my school days is we didn't question a lot. And in some ways that was good. But of course, in another way, that was bad because we kind of, we started to believe all these things that now we understand not to be true. But I'm not sure how many untruths we were really taught. We were just taught basic facts. And then, of course, along came the concept of helping with critical thinking and so on. But what I'm saying is if students question too much, and there's many different opinions about this, they're not going to listen. They're not going to learn the basics. They're not going to learn the facts. But we have to understand that what we're hearing or reading might not be correct. When I was a school librarian, I pointed out to the kids all the books that have been written about Abraham Lincoln, hundreds, thousands.
And they tell
That make one
stories.
book better than another, or one right and one wrong. Maybe yes, maybe some are right and wrong. But everybody gets that opportunity to read, write, but also to listen. And we do have to listen critically. So if nothing else, maybe that will come out of this movement.
Okay. Mike, what do you see? I mean, do you see that this is an opportunity where there is more willingness among Americans to really face our history?
Well, I was going to say that the question of whether or not this is divisive, I would say for most of white America, this is a slap in the face. This is a slap in the face to put all of that in one place and say, look at what you did, is a hard pill to swallow. And I think we have to just acknowledge that, right? That for most people who haven't been in the process of looking at these things and studying these things. I mean, how many people do you really think have read John Hope Franklin outside of academia? We know her from the academic circles, but this is, as I said, a popularization of ideas that have been floating around a long time, but also putting them in a way that, I don't know if I used this phrase already, it's a through line from 1619 to today. And you can look at everything that's happened and all the issues that have come up between whites and blacks from the time Black people landed on these shores through this lens, and it automatically resets your mind to saying, aha, this is why things are the way they are. This is why people are upset. This is why, we have ghettos or whatever the issue is. This is all here. And I think, I think it's going to take time for much of white America to absorb this shock, and for this origin story to integrate itself into the narrative that is currently told. But I do think that because this has been done in first of all, such a professional way and such a big way, that we all have to wrestle with this now. And I personally think that's a good thing. But obviously all of America, particularly white America, does not feel that way. And you're seeing a lot of backlash, certainly from the conservative right, but even some of the historians who picked apart the original essay, I don't know where they were when some of these white people were writing these, hagiographies of Robert E. Lee or whatever, I don't see them picking apart all that. So there's, she was a woman, she was a Black woman, she was a non-credentialed in the sense of, I don't think she has a doctorate. So, there's many different phases of her aspects of what she was doing that, maybe she shouldn't have been doing, but she did it. And it's out there now, and now we have to wrestle with it.
I think, thank you for sharing that, Mike. I think one of the purposes that Nikole has always said was that she wants people now to hear the date 1619 and now have a new understanding of what it is. And I don't think anyone right now, well, let me just ask you this. How does the origin story of the US change if we mark the beginning of US history in 1619 instead of 1776? How does the origin story change?
Is that to anybody?
Who's that for?
Oh, that is, why don't you go, Steve?
Oh, okay. Well, how does the origin story? Well, it changes the story dramatically. I mean, one of the things that I like, and I'm going to push back on the last answer just a little, and
Okay.
not because I disagree with it, but I think that it's incomplete. I mean, and what I mean by that is, with respect, since 1619. There has been a pendulum swing on conversations around race, right? And we get to a shifting point or a sentinel moment, right? And immediately there is a backlash. We saw, like, most recently, the backlash to electing a African-American president was to elect a super white one, right? Well, America has done that literally since its founding, right? I mean, and so when you ask like where we are, in this moment, we are in a pendulum swing where majority culture is rejecting, minority storytelling. Right, and how that shapes the narrative. Now, to get back to your question, like, well, how does that shape the narrative? Like if you start the narrative at 1776 with the date that the deed was signed, right? Or they begin to sign the paperwork, right? You fail to understand what went into the building, what went into the foundation, what went into, like, we do not understand our history because we don't understand the basis of our economic foundations. We don't know how we predicated our earning. I mean, and let me just in short order, right? We have a group of Europeans who took two of the most important resources that you can have in earning, land and hands.
Yeah.
That's half the game right there. That's half the game, right? I mean, so like when you understand that that's half the game, and you begin to facilitate your understanding around, well, how does this shape history? How does it shape more or less our economies? How does it shape who receives and who does not receive? How does it shape our valuation of people? Right? So, shifting it back to 1619 gives you a much clearer understanding of America's valuation of different slices of humanity.
Thank you. Thank you. Linda, do you have anything you'd like to comment on, how the origin story changes if we mark the beginning in 1619 instead of 1776?
So one of the good things that I noted in the whole series, at least the online version of the 1619 story, is that it gave people an opportunity to tell their stories, their family stories.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how does that change things? When I first heard about the most recent 1619 movement,
Yes.
i.e. with Nikole, but as I said, I heard about it first via a program at the Library of Congress. So my first thought was, when people hear this commemorative date, they're going to think the Black people in this country first arrived in 1619, whereas in reality,
That's not true. And we know
It's-
that's not true.
Right.
the first documented shipload of people arrived in 1619. But the story really goes back further than that. So, like with so many things, it's pretty complicated. And because I knew of the Wampanoag Indians who were very brown, I knew about the whalers who came over, some from Asia, some from maybe South America, some from West Africa, and that there were Black people here before then,
Absolutely.
many of whom never actually were enslaved. Now, we know they were subjugated to an extent in some instances,
Mhm.
but I hesitate to want to use 1619 as the beginning of the nation's history. Now, there's another book, what is it, Love Letters of W.E.B. Du Bois? I might have the incorrect
Yeah.
title.
Yeah.
And it's fiction, but we can always learn through fiction as well. So, and I have to admit, I haven't read it. I've only read about it. But the author posits that the nation was built on the accumulation of wealth. And indeed, that is true. And yes,
Mhm.
slavery was a major part of that. It was more like, we're going to get money by any means necessary.
Yeah.
And people need to understand that. But to say that that was the beginning of the nation, I'm not sure if that's correct.
Can I chime
I
in
add-
on that?
Oh,
Can I chime in on that? Just
yes,
like
go,
just a
go
little.
right ahead, Stephen.
Yeah,
I've got
because when
something to chime in too.
Yeah, because when you look at the economies of slavery, right? One of the things, and I appreciate your understanding, because like one of the things that I thought we should have done, and like maybe we can do it now, is acknowledge that there was a bunch of there were 8 indigenous tribes that
Yeah.
traipsed across Maryland, right? I don't know how many in Virginia, right? And so let's
Absolutely.
honor the folk who who walked these lands before us. But I mean, I think it's like when you look in terms of American economies, the very fabric of just about everything that they did resulted in slave economies. 90% of the people, of African descent literally live below the Mason-Dixon line and are forced into labor. Right now, what's going on in the North? Like I have to remind folk that the North is not a bunch of abolitionists.
Right.
These are banks,
Mhm.
textile plants, insurance companies. Like, who is not making money, off of slave enterprises?
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
There's not a single solitary strand. Like, it is really hard in America between 1619 and like even post-slavery, not to make your money off the backs of African. Like, just think in terms of what it means to father a child if you're a white man, and you can actually make money
Yeah.
off of
Exactly.
selling that baby.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Like, and so how that proliferates, like, I mean, not genetically,
Mhm.
but in economies.
Sure.
So I kind of push back on that notion. There is not a whole lot of money or GDP that America makes that is not predicated on what I think they rightly point out is America's original sin.
Mhm.
Every dollar that flows through. I have to
Yeah.
remind folk that Prudential Insurance, Lloyd's of London, Aetna, these people indemnified slave ships
Mhm.
and damaged cargo. Right. So it's
And
okay to
enslaved
throw
people.
humanity.
Yeah.
They
Can I
insured their
just-
enslaved property. Yeah.
Right.
Right, man. So Yeah, I mean, so like I'm gonna cut that in there. So I'm gonna cut that, but like
Yeah.
yeah, we got to be careful about, we got to look at how America actually made its money.
Right, but the one point that I just wanted to add, when we start thinking about the earliest people of African descent that were in
Mhm.
the United States, we have to recognize that, back in the early 1500s, we're talking about, during the age of exploration, there were
Mhm.
Africans that trekked across many lands in North, Central, South America, and many,
Mhm.
traveled
Mhm.
with the Spanish. I mean, Ponce de Leon, Cortez, De Soto, they often had Africans that were working as soldiers, interpreters. Not all of them were enslaved people. I mean, many
Mhm.
people came over very early on. So I understand why Nikole, selected the date 1619. I think the only thing that I want to just say is that, it sometimes paints the picture that all persons of African descent arrived in America as enslaved persons, and that's not,
Yeah, that's not, no, that's
true.
not accurate. Yeah, we should be able to have two thoughts at the same time. Like we should see Black people as explorers and world conquerors, you know what I mean? And beating a pathway to new spaces. Like literally, before that we shut down their movement. I mean, and so that's why I think 1619 kind of stops all of that from happening. So all of that free exploration, where Europeans and Africans and people who live across the Mediterranean are exploring the world together, that kind of shuts down after slavery is industrialized.
Mhm.
Well,
Okay.
I think those are really interesting points, and I want to support Nikole's 1619 date simply because she's talking about the American story, right? And these are the stories of the Americas, right, in the exploration. But she's talking about when they entered the British colonies
Mhm.
and became part of that British story that became what we now know today as the United States of America. And it's interesting that we don't, except unless you're from Virginia, you don't hear much about 1607, right? And Jamestown. You hear that here in Virginia history, and my kids got all that. And you can visit Jamestown and all that. But as she rightly points out, most of America knows the origin story as 1620 when the Pilgrims came
Mhm.
in the North, right?
Mhm.
Where they didn't have necessarily enslaved people at that point. So and this predates that, right? This is turning it back. And I think it's really interesting that she does put the focus on Virginia, because first of all, that's where they landed, but also because that's where the majority of wealth was, thanks to the enslaved people who did the work. And also that's where the most important politicians were from at the early part of this country's history.
And where
So
all those crazy laws were made up about
yes,
miscegenation and all that stuff.
exactly.
Yeah. Virginia is the crux of the problem for sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, Maryland as well. Maryland is Maryland is the kissing. I mean, the amount of money that is made off of the slave trade post 1808 by Marylanders and Virginians. They had 12 slave shops in Baltimore City, and in 1860, when it's at the spark of the right before the Civil War jumps off, and nearly 2/3 of his Black citizens are free. They're trading their bodies southward, right? I mean, and that it means again, like slave economies were like Maryland didn't have cotton economies, like the rest of the South. They dealt slaves.
Mm.
Sure. All right.
But I think it's interesting, and it's important to point out the book that really pushed the whole capitalism of slavery, I think, is The Half That's Never Been Told. I think, and she references that book. And I think one of the reasons she wanted to do this book is because the magazine didn't have room for footnotes, right? And that's what I got pushed back on by all these historians.
Sure.
Well, where did you get that? Where'd you get it? So she had the opportunity to footnote it all right here, and it's heavily documented and footnoted, and I think that's really a good thing, because it will make its way into academia now in a way that the magazine wouldn't have. But there are so many exceptional historians that she references. And I'm just talking about through the two major essays and the preface that Nikole Hannah-Jones has written. I'm not even talking about all the other, as Steve pointed out, all the other great writers and historians that are in there. But it really, it pulls together all this knowledge that we said has been out there and puts it in one place.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I want to move our conversation in just a little bit. One of the big premises of the book is that, slavery is so foundational to US that its legacy can be seen throughout all aspects of modern society. And I think that's one of the things that she says. There are 3 chapters that I want you to weigh in on. One of them was the chapter on punishment. The other one had to do with inheritance, and the other one had to do with medicine. So let me just start with the chapter on punishment. We all know Bryan Stevenson, and he reminds us that the US has the highest rate of incarceration of any nation on earth. While we may represent only 4% of the planet's population, but 22% of it's imprisoned. Do you feel that the modern day prison system acts as a continuation of slavery? I'll go to you first, Mike. Looking at, how people are being incarcerated right now, is it modern day slavery? What do you think?
Well, I'm going to, ask the white guy, right? So
I'm going to ask everyone.
I think Bryan Stevenson and also Michelle Alexander have done an incredible job of bringing this to, the attention of the public, that that this carceral state that we now live in, and we don't even, well, hello. This carceral state that we live in, and we don't pay much attention to it because everybody's put away. I was actually at the NAACP meeting in Philadelphia in 2015 when President Obama released his criminal justice plan, his big plan that sadly never went anywhere. But he really used the research of Michelle Alexander and Bryan Stevenson, and it was throughout the speech that he gave. But the pitch that he made to America was, it's costing us too much money. This is crazy that we're locking all these people up, mostly for limited small crimes, particularly drug-related crimes, those books need to be changed. But also look how much it's costing us in not only actual money, but human capital and human potential. And I'll just say this from a personal standpoint. I had a brother who was incarcerated for 30 years. So I know this story, very personally. And we don't have to get into the specifics of it, but it was a serious crime. There were questions about whether or not he did it or not, but there must have been a way that they could have used my brother in this society in a better way than locking him up for 30 years. I know that for sure. And we have to find another way of managing, I guess you'd say, the behavior of our people, so that everybody who's doesn't get locked up when they do something stupid. And that seems to be what's happening now. I know we have a big crime problem in this country at the same time, and that also has to be managed appropriately.
Sure.
But I think we've erred way on the side of, if there's even a whiff of criminality, put them away.
The other part of that is we need to revisit the 13th Amendment, which clearly stated, and I'm reading, neither slavery neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the
Yes.
party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United
Mhm.
States. Da, 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 da.
Mhm.
So the people who wrote that,
Yes.
they no doubt knew what they were doing,
Right.
so that they could somehow justify what we can call the continuation of slavery.
Yeah.
There's also different ways of looking at that. I mean, now this was written right after the Civil War. Today, a similar thing is continuing. So the argument is, or the question is it really a continuation of that amendment, or is it something else? I mean, you asked the question, I'm asking a question too.
Yeah.
So Linda, you raise an extraordinarily interesting point, and I love the fact that you were. This is Marshall, by the way.
Hi, Marshall.
My dog's name is Langston.
Well, there you go.
But you raise a critically interesting point. I'm gonna kind of like put out there a historical footnote that a lot of people don't know. And well, unless you read the Alexander book, you might, you
Mhm.
might know this. That Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens wrote an alternative version of the 13th Amendment that did not include the criminal exception.
Mhm.
But the only way that the majority of the senators would accept it
Yeah.
was if they had this provision that allowed states, right, to criminalize their locals. I mean, so like the criminal industrial complex that we see today, first off, that's not the first time that happened. You both know that that happened in the 1870s, immediately right after slavery, where every state and lots of localities, made Black vagrancy a crime,
Mhm.
right? And so what's the economic output of that? Now you can sell their labor back to the
Exactly.
landowner, right, for a fraction of the cost.
Mhm.
Now I'm going to jump straight forward. I mean, when did this new system evolve? Right at the end of the Industrial Revolution.
They
Right
needed
at the
workers.
right, we no longer needed workers in the same way that we did in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? Or the early 60s. That ship had sailed. And so now, much like after slavery, loitering is a crime, punishable by how? Taking your labor.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when you look at that, like who's, like let's do calculation. Let's move the, I'm not an economist, or an accountant, but it's not really difficult to do the, to make determinations around who wins and who loses in that. So with the criminal, like look at for-profit prisons now, right? We have like literally for-profit prisons. And so I think it's brilliant to like from that, like Brian Stevens does a remarkable job tying together this continuum, because I think that that's the failure in our learning of American history. Everything that they talk about has been on the continuum. Something that started way back then and stayed on the steady line that produced the kind of results that we see today.
Yep.
But, but because of our understanding of American history, we have blank spots. It's like amnesia in certain, we forget about
All time.
Yeah, we have Alzheimer's in 1917.
No.
Yeah, we have like memory loss, right? When it comes to 1917, we forget that white soldiers came back and were pissed that Black men were in their jobs, and what, there were 35, 40 riots all over the country in that year alone. You know, so I think, yeah, he ties it together brilliantly, but he also does a good job at tying it to the economic constructs.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think if you go back to what Nikole Hannah-Jones, I mean, what she originally said is that, slavery, was an economic system. It wasn't a racist system. It was a system of economic exploitation that was
Yeah.
justified through racism. And I think the question I want to ask right now, I think I'm just going to move on to the chapter on inheritance. Tremaine Lee wrote that chapter, and in it he said, today's racial wealth gap is perhaps the most glaring legacy of American slavery and the violent economic dispossession that followed. And here's something he said, and I want to ask you, do you agree with it? He said the post-Reconstruction plundering of Black wealth was not just a product of spontaneous violence, but it was etched in law and public policy. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But Mike, you want to expound? Who wants to expound on that? I can.
Let me jump in.
Sure.
Just last night, it was interesting. I watched the PBS NewsHour every night religiously. Maybe some of the people who are tuned in here do as well. There was a wonderful story on Black farmers. And if you think, if you go all the way back to end of the Civil War, as Hannah-Jones does, that one moment of possibility where Sherman had said, well, maybe we can give you, 40 acres and a mule.
Right.
And we'll put you over in the islands off of South Carolina or Georgia or whatever. And that was immediately snatched back. Oh no, we can't do that. The one thing that Black people at that time knew how to do was farm, right? I mean, that's what they had been used for. So if anything, if land had been provided to them and they had had the opportunity to work that land and make a living, that 100 years would have produced wealth for them, right? In some capacity. But no, we freed them, but they were free to do what? They had no jobs. They had worked the land. They had no land. Where were they going to go? Now today, fast forward, this story was about the recent allowance for Black farmers. I think it was $4 billion to try to make up for some of the, not even that issue from back in the 1800s, but back in the 1960s and 70s when the US Department of Agriculture was discriminating against Black farmers.
With the loans, absolutely.
With the loans, they weren't giving them the loans that they needed. White farmers could get them, with the snap of a finger, but Blacks had to jump through all those hoops, and often the answer was no at the end. And there have been lawsuits about that. There were already billions of dollars given out about that. But the issue that this story told is even the money that was in Biden's original American Rescue Plan for Black farmers has now been challenged in court by white farmers as being discriminatory, right? Oh, you're going to give them something that you're not giving me. Instead of saying, I see this is making up for all that other stuff that was done years ago when I had an advantage and they didn't. It's just shocking that this continues to go on.
Thank you for sharing that, Mike. The question that I just want to put out on the floor right now is, how do you repair the damage that was done and bring about economic justice? So, of course, the question, leads one to, is reparations the way to go? What does reparations look like? The question is, how do you repair the damage that was done through slavery, the damage that's being done now to farmers, and bring about economic justice? How do we do it? Any thoughts?
So I have a couple. One is, and this is why I think this is why we're having this discussion, right? We have to reframe the narrative. We have to reframe people's understanding of how this country was formed and what it did over a period of time, and what the results are that we live with today. How problematic they are. One of the things that I think that Americans, Americans typically look at their ledger in wins and losses, right? This accounting spreadsheet, right? Where there's winners and losers, right? Where an economic exercise shows you that you grow by building around the margins, and that lifts all boats, right? I mean, and so I think that we have to really reframe the way that we talk about like winners and losers. Like we've allowed, smart people have allowed that for this winners and losers conversation for a really, really, really long time. The other thing that, I don't think it's by mistake that the great majority of people in this country don't know anything about history, the history of this country. I mean, very, like there, I mean, it's, I used to
So
laugh
are
and
we
joke.
faulting our education system?
No. I'm faulting what we teach, like for real, because teaching what we teach is litigated and put into law, right? I mean, so like what is being taught in Maryland schools is in Comar, right? It is, it is documented. There's a script,
Right.
right?
You got to pass the test, right?
No. But there's certain subject matters, right? I mean, they incorporate this into the law,
But
right?
can I just add something else? But it's getting worse. I mean, when I saw something in the news, I mean, I think as of November 24th, 29 states have already introduced bills or taking other steps that would restrict teaching critical race theory. And I don't even know if we're going to have time to even talk about that, but they are limiting how teachers can discuss racism and sexism and all of that. So that is something that is definitely before us right now with, I think there are going to be increased limits on what can be taught.
I think we're at a burning books moment. What do you think, Linda? I think we're burning books. I mean, I think when you say to someone that you can't learn from a particular text, is that part of learning? Because I was always taught like I was not like I went to college in the 80s. We didn't protest the people we didn't agree with. We went and read everything that they wrote and sat on the front row, when they came to speak to us, and we challenged their ideas. I think that we've gotten far, far, far away from that. And now we're telling people what they can and cannot read, what they can and cannot learn, what they're, and I think I think that's kind of dangerous. I don't think that that's part of I'm not sure that that's how societies evolve.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I was a school librarian. I was in Montgomery County schools where even the books that went into the school libraries from elementary to the secondary schools, they had to be evaluated before they were put on the shelves. I'm saying theoretically evaluated because really all of media specialists, library media specialists had to do was basically sign off on it and get a second signature. So we always had some books that I'm sure some parents wouldn't. I'm saying parents, and that brings up a whole nother discussion because it's parents and other people in the community who are making these decisions. And a long time ago, I used to teach in New York, and it was during a time of great change when I was actually part of a movement that was bringing teachers from HBCUs to teach in this particular district in Brooklyn, where at the time it was just about all Puerto Rican and Black students, but mostly white and Jewish teachers. Okay. And sometimes people ask me now, well, did it work when they brought the Black teachers there? I'm not sure. My point about that, though, is going back to the libraries. And someone in that New York program, one of the Black scholars, said, asking the parents what to do in the schools is almost like asking the blind to lead the blind. Now that's a controversial statement in itself, because parents today feel like they got to help run the schools, right? And yet we're saying parents shouldn't have anything to say, because whoever decides what should go in the classroom should be up to the teachers and the administrators. And the publishers come into play here. As a school librarian, all of us used to lament the fact that just about all of the books about Black folks had something to do with slavery, okay? And or drugs in the community. I'm talking children's books, well, at least middle school age books, young adult books. There were always a few children's books, whether we're talking, can't recall immediately the names of any, but that has been a problem on the other side. We also have to remember that in my parents.
One question: Who
Yes.
chose? Who got to select those children's books?
You mean the ones that went into the school libraries?
Yeah.
Technically, the librarians. Okay, so we
Okay.
get brochures from publishers. We go to the American Library Association meetings and other places. The publishers are the ones that kind of drive what's really going in. And that also, I think, applies to the textbook publishers.
Mhm.
And so what people are saying now is we want a different kind of information. Now, I'm not really a part of writing the publications. I'm sorry, the textbooks, especially. When it comes to children's books, this is why I tell people all the time, you got to write your story, your family story, because those bits and pieces of your family stories can really help correct the narrative. And then, of course, for instance, when you look at a book like Wanted by the Sons, then Isabel Wilkerson in that book told stories from different individuals' points of view.
Yes. And
Okay.
it was awesome. Yeah.
Right. The book Juneteenth by Annette Gordon Reed, the recent book, is really a memoir. She's
Mhm.
telling her story. How can anybody dispute that story? Okay. And so sometimes instead of positing stuff, we have to tell the real story of what we know happened back then.
Okay.
And I'm
Okay.
not saying that that can only be done through genealogy, but that is certainly one. But we have to write some of our own things and insist that they go into the libraries. I don't know if I'm answering your question, Stephen, or not.
No, like, so yeah, how do we get those texts that are like the great majority of textbooks come out of Texas, right? Texas has always been a big printer.
A lot of them
Uh,
come out of Illinois, outside of
uh,
Chicago too,
um,
but all of them.
but though, and so like what I'm trying to kind of get to is like who has final say. Like my kid, I have a 10-year-old,
Mhm.
right, who goes into a school every day, and we have a little bit of say into like what goes into his libraries, because I live in Columbia, Maryland, and
Mhm.
parents out here are steeply involved in what their children, and so there's kind of like a participation and evaluation process.
Mhm.
But like, how does a kid in Baltimore City right now, because I've been to that library, only end up with a reading selection that is not inspiring, that either makes him a slave or a slave to narcotics?
Mm.
Mm.
You know what I mean? And so like, and I've never gotten a really fundamental like answer to like, well, how does that process?
Right.
You know,
We just have to search deeply for books that have a more positive influence or more positive story. There are some out there. Sharon said, I'm considered an expert in children's multicultural literature. We search far and wide for these kinds of
Mhm.
materials. But indeed, there's still, well, I retired in 2013, so I can't say exactly what is in all of the school libraries, but we do have to remind the librarians and the media specialists who also need education themselves of the kinds of materials to look for or to avoid.
If I want to jump in here,
Okay.
Linda, I want to,
Oh, can I just, I'm sorry, stop you just 1 second. I just want to be mindful of some of the questions that are appearing in the chat. and I want to make certain that one gets addressed. This was actually from Elaine, and she says, my question is, why did African Americans put up with their horrible treatment for so long? Who wants to tackle that?
So while somebody answers that, I have to step off for 1 second. I'll be right back. I apologize.
Okay, sure. Steve, why don't you go right ahead?
Because they were minorities in the country. Like early on, there was a policy of strict control. So in spaces where whites actually were a minority, they were in many of the southern cities, you know, and many of the southern spaces where they were plantations, you know, Black people were in the minority, but there was strict control. As immigration, particularly between 1820, you know, and the breakout of the Civil War, lots of poor white Europeans start to kind of funnel in. And they began to kind of like build they become the infrastructure, you know, for lack of a better way of saying, policing the movement of Black people. Right. And so like while they are in the majority, you know, there's a lot of fear and trepidation, you know, like how does, you know, if you read caste, how does, you know, one of the elements of caste is you have to have fear and, fear and terror campaign. And that fear and terror campaign kept people in place, even when Black people were in the majority of the space, but they had no access to any information and no access to weaponry, you know. But you do see in 1831 where when they do have access to those things, that it changes the course of world history. I'm sorry, like not in 1831, in 1804, with the Haitian Revolution. Right,
the Haitian Revolution was.
The Haitian Revolution just changes the way
Absolutely.
that whites all over the world, you think about like how they are going to police their economic system.
That was the growth of the police force.
Right. So like, you know, a lot of it is through fear and intimidation. And then by a certain point, it's just kind of like the fact that Black people are like, you know, white people have penetrated the country so much that Black people are the minority, and they're only found in sparse, you know, they are on the coast and in the South. I've been to 40 states. There are a lot of places where you can go in this country where you don't see people of color.
Okay. Did you want to respond to that, Mike?
Yeah, I just want to jump in. I think from my perspective, I think it's amazing the amount of resistance that Black people did throughout their history in this country, given where they were and the repercussions of that resistance should it be found out.
Right.
First of all, it's amazing that there is a Black culture in this country. I mean, the fact that you all survived what y'all went through is a miracle of God and a testament to your own resilience and survival instincts. But as I read history, there's always been a resistance culture in, you know, from the moment you all arrived and were, you know, said you're not free anymore. You're reporting to these people.
Yeah, I didn't want to take exception to the question. I just wanted to, you know, answer it as is. But I think Mike quite points out an extraordinarily important point, is that these people are always resisting, you know, in quiet and innocuous ways, and in some way very loud. I mean, very, like, you know, and that's what like if you read the chapter around music and what music means, you know, to our culture, there's a power in that. There's a resistance. I mean, and it creates what like America knows as the only American music form born in America.
Right.
I mean, and so, yeah, there is, I mean, like, so now I think that I think what the questioner was asking, and I might be presumptuous, is why didn't Black people take up arms?
We did.
Which, and again, in different ways.
In some cases, that was done.
And that's exactly right. I mean, there are, I think I've identified like 70 riots between 1820 and 1916. In Black spaces, like, and they you mean it's not a lot of times where they just cower,
Sure, absolutely.
but they are the minority.
I would say this is an act of resistance. I would say this, putting this out there is yet the most recent act of resistance. That, hey, you got this narrative, I don't know what you're talking about. This is our narrative.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you. I want to we have time for maybe one or two more questions. And Betty Shaw actually talks about reparations. And she simply says reparations could possibly be enumerated just as compensation is calculated in lawsuits today. What do you think about reparations?
Well, so
I need to give everyone just 1 minute to discuss this.
Okay, so like, yeah, I'm gonna be very quick. When I first read the article with Ta-Nehisi Coates, I mean, like, that was really like my first really understanding of like how reparations could work. I mean, I think what like when we're not talking about, we shouldn't be talking about like handing out everybody a check, but I think that like the systems that perpetuated and facilitated the destruction of whole communities, that work needs to be reversed, right? I mean, and so I think that focusing on systemic solutions, right? A banking system, like our environmental system, focusing on whole systems changes, right? Is a way of repairing the kind of, because the damage that we're talking about is incalculable.
Okay.
But you could put a number.
Go ahead, Mike first, and then Linda.
I'm sorry, Linda.
What's your view on reparations?
I would say you could put a number on. I think, just go back and read Ta-Nehisi Coates' article. He's got some ideas there. Nobody's really taken this up and said, okay, let's try this. Let's tinker with this. Let's come up with a suggestion that might be palatable or might be workable. This has been talked about, right, for over 150 years now. So, let's stop talking. Let's do something about it. Yes, Black people have been economically, what would be
suppressed?
Well, I want to say disenfranchised, but somehow their hard work was not even paid for, right? So obviously, there are reparations that need to be made if we are to come together and be whole as a country. We need to figure out a way to do that. And I think on the capitalistic side, people are going to say, well, where does it stop? But I think we could put a number on it. We could figure it out. And Ta-Nehisi Coates has some really good ideas.
Wonderful. Any thoughts on that, Linda?
Only that for sure we should be entitled to reparations. Again, if through genealogy and studying your family history, you can document, 1, that your ancestors had been enslaved, 2, that maybe since enslavement, they had somehow been discriminated against in terms of getting a job, getting in school somewhere. We know it was so many. So it doesn't have to go through genealogy, but if it can be documented, that is what helps. And to me, a book like 1619 that points out all of the discretions or transgressions, that the thing that it does help to do is point out all of these things that do justify reparations. So of course we know how Georgetown University is giving scholarships to some of the descendants of the people who were
Sure,
formerly
sure.
enslaved there. But here's another interesting thing. Recently, you all heard that Capital One Bank has stopped charging, what do you call it, late fees or whatever.
Uh-huh.
Now, that's not directed specifically at African Americans, but maybe it is. Look when it's happening, you know, after all of the uproar in the community, even though it's maybe not only Black folks who were affected by the various banking fees, but that's just one little thing. Anything that we're charged extra fees for in this society could perhaps
The
be
Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act was an act of reparations, in my point of view.
Okay, all right. And I'm glad you just mentioned that because healthcare is the very last question I want to pose to us as we wind up. Linda Villarosa had a chapter on medicine. And I want you to respond to one of her statements. And I want to tell you a little story that is actually in that chapter. She says that Black Americans disproportionately contracted COVID-19 because of the many ways America's history of racial violence and inequality is baked into the institutions and structures of our society. And she actually shared the story, I don't know how many people remember this, of Dr. Susan Moore. She practiced family and geriatric medicine near Indianapolis. And in November of 2020, she tested positive for COVID. And she detailed on her Facebook page the disrespectful treatment by a white physician. And she, of course, died 2 weeks later at the age of 52. But what she says has to do with the history of how, since the times of slavery, how African Americans are looked at. Their skin is different. When it comes to pain, I mean, they can tolerate more pain. There are a lot of things that she said. And what she said was, this doctor who knew she was a doctor didn't listen to her lungs, didn't touch her, didn't offer any additional antiviral medication, didn't address her excruciating neck pain with additional pain meds. She said she felt like she was treated like she was she couldn't get pain meds because they felt that, she really wasn't in pain. So, when we talk about social determinants of health, I mean, food, transportation, air pollution, healthcare, all of that, comes to play. So I just want to end here with your feelings on, why is it and what can we do? I mean, we have seen a situation where Black Americans, were hospitalized more than 3 times the rate of white people, 2.8 times, I think more times more likely to die from COVID. Is this the remnants of a system of slavery that we still need to address to make certain that African Americans get appropriate health care?
Steve, you're the healthcare guy.
Yeah, definitely. So the fact that health is not an economy while they're slaves is a really important notion. The only way that health is a factor is if they're in a non-productive state, right? I think it's really, really, really important to note that that becomes the starting place for the evaluation as to whether or not an entire group of people require certain levels of care. I think that certainly not only is it the remnants of slavery, when you think in terms of the fact that in order to make a man a slave, you said that he doesn't have the mental faculties, and he needs to be led, right? That's a kind of like, that's not a trope. That's a factor of production. Well, that's the same notion that when the Flexner Report is written in 1910, that says that only a small percentage of African Americans should be eligible for medical school, right? Because they don't have the faculties. What they should be is clinical matter.
Okay.
and not
I'm
doctors.
sorry, Steve, I'm gonna have to cut you off because
Yeah. So
everyone
maybe
else
so
has a chance
yeah.
to
Yeah. So
respond.
yeah.
But,
So
you
the
know,
long and the short of it, yeah, the long and the
mhm.
short of it is definitely clinical. It's definitely a history tied back to the way that we thought about things clinically.
Linda or Mike, any comments about, you know, the story of Dr. Susan Moore? Was that just a bad doctor, or there are certain things baked into, you know, the system that make it such that there are more health inequities for many African Americans?
Linda, you go ahead.
I don't know that much about that particular story. I like to think that in 2021, we have some good white doctors, you know, who will treat Black folks, okay? There are Black doctors who have white PAs and physicians working for them, you know, so there's an opportunity for that oversight. I like to be optimistic. Just this morning, I was at an art exhibit, or did I say this before? Where that featured, what is his name now? I'm sorry for holding you up. Alma Thomas and David Driscoll. And Alma Thomas, who died in 1978, but was a teacher of art and artist for her entire life. She sought the beautiful in everything. And while she was a Black woman, she didn't necessarily see things in Black or white. And she lived in a segregated society to a large extent. Okay. Similarly, David Driscoll, who died just last year of COVID, and of course, I don't know the circumstances surrounding that, he was strongly influenced by white artists. I mean, he did some kind of internships and trainings in Maine and fell in love with Maine. And he also loved nature, you know? So we have to look at how Black folks are people also. You know, there are so many people who say, when I get up in the morning, first thing I see is a Black face. Well, some people see a person and they feel like they can do the same things that anybody else can do. And we also feel like nobody ever told us, some of us, that we had to look out for bad white people or that we couldn't do certain things. You know, maybe it's because of the times or the places we grew up in. So I think at least we want to teach the children that there's hope. You know, I mean, I can't imagine telling kids, okay, your ancestors were enslaved, so maybe you won't be able to do this. And that has been part of the narrative in a way, but we have to be very careful with that.
Okay.
I remember, again, when I was a school
Linda,
librarian,
you
I'm
have
sorry,
about
I'll
a minute.
stop. I'll stop.
Okay, Mike, go right ahead.
So I have two quick stories. Number one, I am the father of 3 Black children, adopted children from the District of Columbia. And in their growing up, you know, we got very good health care for them. I mean, we did not see, and mostly, you know, white doctors. And I continue to hope that today, you know, those types of medical facilities, of course, we're talking about, you know, suburban, white primarily areas. But anyway, I hope for my children because they've gotten pretty good health care up to this point as Black people, as Black children.
One really important point. Some of you all remember the times when Black people would say, don't send me to a Black doctor. Okay. So we have to be fair to everybody. Like all my adult life, I've tried to make it a point to go to Black female doctors, but I've been to some white doctors too. But we kind of have to balance it and understand that we don't want anybody to say, I'm not going to do something because of the race of that person.
But I do want to just jump in, and I thank you for that. I want to jump in and say the area that I study is mostly civil rights history, primarily in Mississippi, right? And in the 1960s, you know, you talk about bad health care for the rural Black people, it was non-existent, honestly. And in like the 1964, 1965, we had an array of Black and white doctors going down into rural Mississippi to set up rural health clinics because they just were non-existent because the power structure there didn't feel it was appropriate or necessary. So, you know, and I think our country does have that legacy that we're still trying to overcome.
Okay. All righty. I want to thank everyone, but I want one last final comment. Why would you tell someone the 1619 Project, The New Origin Story, is a book that they should read? I mean, and what will you do differently now that you have been exposed to the 1619 Project? Steve first. 1 minute, Steve.
I think it's I think it's a seminal piece. It's it's a time that marks history, much like Howard Zinn did back in 1980. Now, the thing that I think that is that why it makes it a must read is like it's a collection of what is 17 chapters, 17 brilliantly brilliantly written pieces. I mean, they're
Absolutely.
beautiful. I mean, they're extraordinary. Like even if you don't agree with certain portions of it, the way that these people are artists in the respect, and they contributed to a whole that I think is just exceptional.
Wonderful. Mike?
We're having a couple people over for dinner on Saturday night. And this is all I'm going to be talking about.
Awesome. Wonderful. Good to hear that. Good to hear.
And I just want to echo Steve's thought that, it's not just the essays, it's the poetry, it's the fiction, everything that's in here is fascinating. I want to quote to end my piece. The very first poem in the book is by Claudia Rankine called The White Line. It's about the ship that brought those 20 plus.
Powerful.
Yeah, it ends with this. And this is really what we've been talking about the whole time. It ends with, she tells the story of this ship that brought these enslaved people to America, and then imagines what their lives might have been like had they not been enslaved. But she talks and harkens back to their African roots. But this is the last line: as if we could stop knowing how to know what we know. We have been trying in this country to stop knowing what we know. Since those people were dropped off here, and it's time that we wake up, and that's what this is all about.
Thank you, Mike. Linda, I'm going to let you have the last word.
So basically, I would just say it's a good read because she does break down the various categories as we've talked about it. Healthcare, education, so on. And if for no reason other than that, it's a good way to understand the different areas in which oppression has continued over the years.
Well, thank you. Well, I want to thank everyone. Special thanks to Linda, Mike, and Stephen for being part of this panel. I really appreciate everything that you've said. And I'll look forward to inviting you to join us on an upcoming panel that we'll have starting the first quarter of 2022.
Oh my goodness,
So much from the Sibley Senior Association. We are so grateful for you, and we just want to extend thanks to you, and thanks to the audience as well. You have certainly come out in great number, and we appreciate that. And we hope that we've opened your mind or planted a seed or given you something to think about. And we look forward for you joining us in our very next session. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Sharon.
And on that,
enjoyed being with the panel. Okay.
Good night to everyone.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, good to meet y'all.